recording. And welcome to our Thursday book launch. My name is Melissa Albrecht. I'm the founding editor of Redheaded Stepchild, and tonight we get to celebrate with Jeff Hardin. And if you weren't here a few minutes ago before we started recording, I'm sorry, you missed some really good conversation. And we've got some mad skills joking and offers of pirouettes and interpretive dance. So hopefully that conversation will circle back around. I'm going to introduce Jeff just briefly. This is your 7th book, Watermark is, Jeff, is that correct?
Yes.
Wow, that's awesome. In the chat section, you can order directly from the publisher. Thank you for holding up the cover. Or you can also get a copy from Jeff directly and get your signed copy that way. I'm going to do a brief overview of some of Jeff's accomplishments. I love this detail, an 8th generation descendant of the county's founder. So you're actually in Hardin County in Savannah, Tennessee.
Well, I live about 100 miles from there, but that's my hometown, Savannah, Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Offer of 4 chapbooks as well as 7 collections of poetry, Fall Sanctuary, Notes for Praise Book, which was selected by Toi Derricotte and published by Jacar Press, Restoring the Narrative, which received the Donald Justice Poetry Prize, Small Revolution, No Other Kind of World. And I do want to note, if there's any of these other books that you want of Jeff's, you can also reach out to him via the PayPal and via his email address. He is a professor of English at Columbia State Community College, and I am going to be pretty swift to turn it over to you. I want to remind everybody to mute yourself once we've done that.
All right.
Welcome, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Well, good. Well, thanks for being here, everybody. It's good to see familiar faces and familiar names. And I'm going to start just in a little slightly different way, because I see one of my genius student friends, but actually guru as well, Barbara Young. And so Barbara's book came out, I think last year, and I wrote a blurb for this, and I love this book. I just love this book. So I know I'm supposed to be promoting mine, but I'm going to read a poem of hers just because I love this poem. It's the very last poem in the book. It's called About the Language and Inevitable Death. Once upon a time, and this is before you or I or your mother or the dry, disappearing women who live under bridges were born, words, some words, had meanings unlike today's. Night, for instance, and alone. Alone could fill all the space between all the yellow cities on the map with a hollow more empty than the echo of the emptiest of moved from homes, dust where the dresser was, a penny, half a toothpick. But we live in pre-owned valleys and cook on the stove that came with the house. Wearing heirloom language to work, to regret, to shop for our suppers, we name common things and say we die and go to heaven. Call the yellow night sky black. I just love that. Well, anyway, so those of you who know me a little better than others know that I write a poem every day. And so I usually begin readings with the most recent poem I've written. And so this is from 5 o'clock this morning while the rest of you were sleeping. And this is called A Poem is a Way of Anchoring Thoughts. How long the night stays night is not up to me. I can't be trusted anyway, having long ago been discredited for applauding tadpoles in silt. Out of nothingness, God thought up my mind, which thinks too much about God and nothingness and some corner of eternity apportioned to me. Given the world we find ourselves grieving over, new, unimaginable atrocities, it's easy to believe some said no when asked to drop nets and follow him. Shouldn't there be a moth whose sole existence is to alight upon each bloom of a redbud, realigning the earth's spin and anchoring one man's thoughts? Some words are so labyrinthine, we may never return. Still, we pray or write poems. We listen toward what might begin, finger pressed against a single chord. So the book Watermark really began in 2004. I was sitting at Buckhead Coffee Shop here in Columbia, Tennessee, with my good poet pal, Michelle Miller. And I said, I'm always coming up with new ideas or trying to come up with ideas for poems. And I said, hey, Michelle, I think I'm going to write a poem where I take old phrases out of poems that never went anywhere. I'm going to make them the titles of new poems. And so then I wrote a title at the top of the page. And as soon as I did, I decided, oh, wait a minute. What if I just put this vertical down the page? And as I did that, I mean, I always had a kind of math mind. So, horizontal, vertical, X, Y axis. So I thought of this, placing these words down the margins of the page. And that's how this kind of idea was born. And then I decided all these phrases that I have paid attention to in my life or that have meant something to me, they tended to be about 5 words. And so there were a lot of them from the Bible, a lot of them from literature, even my favorite band, U2, One Life with Each Other. Just these 5-word phrases. So I began to write, I made a list of them first. And then, over the next 4 or 5 years, I wrote most of this book. And I thought I'd read the very first one I wrote. It's not the first one in the book, but the very first one is called Far From Everything. And so I had a line in a failed poem, how quiet must I be? And so I put that vertically down the page. Far from everything. How even the word apricot can turn the day's course and stun the heart is reason enough to search this stack of books to find one word this headlong century needs. Quiet distends memory and light along the neighbor's roof. Though who forgets those scattered men and diners, hid out from their lives, sparrow faces twittering behind menus while the cashier files her nails. Must be time to count the years again, to walk beneath the squirrel nests, one for every few trees, and to say aloud, I am at home here, far from everything I ever wanted. I want to humble myself, whatever that means, and keep it to myself, if possible. Me, some tangible thing on the earth. Me, some theorem time works out, proving the proof of itself. I want to be unknown like some hermit, born again each day, discovered some decades hence, bones a tidy heap, the roof caved in, the sky and meadow, all there ever was to say. And then I'm going to circle back around. I always love those books that had a poem that precedes all the other poems, kind of epigraph poem, sets in motion. And so this came along later in the process, but I wrote a poem called Behind. And so the reason I suppose I call this form Watermark, I took a book arts class in graduate school. I see my friend Tim Geiger's here. He actually got a double major in that. But in that course, we discussed, people made homemade or made paper. But sometimes there'd be a watermark imprint inside the paper. And I like that idea. It stuck with me all those years later. And just the idea of holding up a sheet of paper to the light and you can see the evidence of its maker. And, you know, sort of religious aspect of my life as well, and just the implications of all that. And then the idea of the watermark phrase being maybe something that might be overlooked by somebody on the first reading, but then might notice it. And that it's also maybe something like a whispered prayer behind the poem. So this is called Behind. Back behind the words, another story is being told, a context other than one I would impose. May I dim in some new light's narrative and, holding a page, glimpse a watermark, as if a whispered prayer I so easily might have lived without. So I think I've got the ability to share my screen. I just wanted to kind of give you a visual of what I'm talking about as well.
Let me make sure I can get you to do that
that's
real
right.
quick.
Yeah, sorry.
I may have to do, no worries. I may have to just double check. Sorry about that. I meant to do it sooner and that should do it.
Okay.
Just check yes when it comes your way.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, Jeff. We
Nothing.
talked about that and I missed my mark.
All right, here we go. So this is what it looks like. This was published online, so it's easy enough to follow. And you might be able to kind of see here, it's got the well-known line from Emily Dickinson, "I'm nobody, who are you?" And so what I ended up doing for the most part was, well, they're all the same shape, but I'd have 2 lines, 3 lines, then one longer line, and then it stitches back through the next word, having weighed the only words I hold. I'm that man on the rooftop others mistake for a jumper, but I am here only to see the skyline closer and to get above the doorpost before the angel passes by. Nobody quite believes me, though, for all my words have fallen past usefulness. I pick them up like stones to glimpse their undersides, to weigh them in my hands and fling them on. Who is this we, for instance, so often spoken of these days? You and I, we're like those farm birds leaving fence posts to fly full-bodied against each other. Still, I believe that we are, nonetheless, gifts to one another. Of that I am sure. For such sentimental claims I'm often dismissed, though I doubt fiercer words will be found in me. You won't remember that boy I was years ago, batting rocks across the creek, but each arc of flight into the brush was one more forgiveness that reached the other side. So I just want to give you a visual of that. And so these have been lots of fun to explore. And I think for me, it was a way of first of all, honoring. I mean, one of the things I tell my students ad nauseum, we are descendants of language. If you really want to, I mean, I'm an 8th generation descendant from the founder of Hardin County. Who is Jeff Hardin really? I am that, but I'm also a descendant of words that William Stafford wrote in poems. And I'm a descendant of Martin Luther King saying, "No lie can live forever." And I'm a descendant of Acts 17:28, "For in him we live and move and have our being." I'm a descendant of Robert Frost, "I have promises to keep." So all of these words, you must change your life, Rainer Rilke says. So I'm a descendant of these words. And I wanted them to be a kind of spine on the poem, something that I would take my own ideas, write about whatever was occurring to me, but align it and realign my thinking through these central words. Or to make my wife happy, stitch, she's a seamstress, to stitch my own thoughts back through these central statements that have stayed with me all these years. And as I said, some of them are biblical phrases. Some of them are from literature. I thought I would start with the one, or I'm starting over, folks. I thought I'd read a poem called Giving Time Back to Itself. And the Watermark phrase is, I give myself unto prayer. I doubt so much I see and hear, I have to steal from sleep to sort out what is true. I find I cannot sleep unless I find I am awake, unless I give time back to itself, asking nothing more. I rarely can, though, with my elegiac heart and my lack of trust, my need to wring the darkness out of myself, to dream of only light inside of light, myself inside the inside that is always growing deeper, even as the light is growing wider, sweeter, farther, inexhaustible, unto the outer reachings of itself. Where I begin, where I leave off, I say the words symmetry, I say their refrain, and like the child I am, close my eyes and listen to my heartbeat's prayer, systole and diastole gather and rush. And when I no longer hear it or care that it is there, I listen to my own listening out past what the mind can believe. So I was teaching William Stafford today. And I met Stafford a couple of times in my life, and he was just such a wonderful presence, obviously, in American poetry. And so some of you may know his poem, Ask Me. At the end of that, he says, what the river says, that is what I say. And sometime when the river is ice, ask me mistakes I've made. Ask me if what I have done is my life. So anyway, I have a poem in this book called What the River Says. And then the phrase down the left-hand margin is, that is what I say. That I have risen yet another morning to have this sense of being in the world, and turned on up the hill to look so wide and far in all directions, is one more mystery of time's unfolding. I guess I cannot know. That I remain while others fell away is God's great secret, the pleasure of his will. What is man that you are mindful of him? David asked, and so did Job. Our lives compared to vapor, to grass, to fig, to lamb, to bread. I have only the same question, asked in what I hope is a tone of wonder, a tone of submission. Though I know too, knowing myself, I hold a part back, my own secret. What I say is what I cannot find my way to say, though it waits for me. This next moment, its stillness, where my foot may find firm footing, or in due time slip, and then be led away. And I thought I'd read just a small poem from this little chapbook that came out last year, Seven Kitchens Press. And it's called Generosity for a Later Generation. Really just to kind of throw out something that I wrote probably, 15, 17 years ago. I wrote a poem called Taking Up the Cause of Affection. And in recent years, one of the things I always tell people is you're writing for now and you're writing for later. So I had written a bunch of titles years ago, taking up the cause of humility, taking up the cause of silence. And so, I discovered this poem again and sent it out, and it finally got published after all those years, taking up the cause of affection. And so I began writing a whole bunch of others and some of those are now appearing in journals. But this is the first poem in this little chapbook, taking up the cause of affection. And I think about it now because it was the first line, this far into a new millennium. Yeah, like 3 years. I mean, here we are like 22 years into the new millennium. But when I wrote the poem, we weren't very far into the millennium. This far into a new millennium, who speaks of affection for meadow sweet or flocks just off the pathway, bent over and breathed in? A shovel used to stand a step inside the barn. One could reach in without looking, without having to wonder what contentment was. Shakespeare couldn't keep the marigold from his poem, nor Rilke a panther from looking out between bars. After a storm, I'm left a yard of twigs. On up in today, the nouns and verbs I live with deepen, drawing me in. Saying them, I feel myself enduring long past my name. With midsummer coming, the beans get ready to send forth runners. I suspect, beneath words we share, some farther reaching grips the earth. And then I thought maybe, I'm looking at, trying to be conscious of my time here, maybe just a couple of poems. And what I want to do with that is I want to honor two people I mentioned in the book, in the acknowledgments. One is Claudia Emerson, and the other is Will Mills, one of my best poet friends for 21 years before he died about a decade ago. And both of those poets were very, well, I mean, they championed these poems. In fact, I remember showing this book to Claudia Emerson somewhere around 2009, I believe, 2009 or 10. And she said, oh, no one's ever, this is really fascinating form, Jeff. This book's going to get picked up immediately. So I want to read a poem that I published a few years ago. It was after Claudia died, but I wrote it at Sewanee, in the chapel at Sewanee during the last time I saw her in 2014, just not even 6 months before she died. And so it's a sonnet called Last Summer. She must have known our voices sounded full of sorrow, for the cancer had returned. And this time it would stay until she couldn't. Outside the chapel, oak limbs anchored down the quietest sky all summer, flitting birds enacting dramas, making little sense. She studied anyway their leaps and fidgets, for everything became a metaphor for what her cells were doing now. They tripped upon each other, shook themselves full force. She must have known we watched her watchful eyes, and maybe, too, she knew we knew her mind and where it had to go, interpreting through what would soon be all there was of her. And then the poem I'll end with is, it's called Trying to Hear a Prayer, and it's to Will Mills. And Will loved the Irish poet Yeats, and he would set songs, or set some of Yeats's poems to songs. And of course, I hear lake water lapping, if you're familiar with that phrase out of Yeats. So that's my anchoring watermark phrase in this poem, Trying to Hear a Prayer. I come again to find these bits of driftwood, shore-caught and careless, some hollow-hearted Sunday evening when I can't remember what the days were headed toward. I try to hear the prayer you prayed beneath a mountain's trees as we sat on a bench in your life's last month, knowing what we knew but didn't speak aloud. Once, years earlier, you quoted Yeats' Lake Isle poem while standing in bean rows, planted near a cabin you restored. You sang the poem's cadence forth, described how words could be like water, cool and clear upon the tongue, plunging toward the heart's deep core, an idea inside which you shivered, as though the air you breathed were lapping against your whole body, against your cells, water to water. And when you closed your eyes, I did too. And we stood there, are still standing there, hearing our deepest selves.
I was having to type in, and when you closed your eyes, I did too, because it was just so powerful. And then I realized, oh, I'm supposed to unmute. Jeff, that was amazing. If people want to unmute and take a moment to say thank you to Jeff for reading. Thank you so very much. I loved hearing about the form and the watermark and kind of the spine and the ancestral lineage of your work. That was fascinating to me. And then I had told you likely we would want to talk about your process, and you already said you write a poem a day, and then you read the poem you wrote, and I thought, well, that's the kind of stuff that would take me 10, 20 years to write, not 5 a.m. in the morning.
Right.
Those ugly babies would have to stay in their cribs. I'm not showing anybody. It's just amazing. There was so many images that got written down in the chat section, which of course I'll send to you. But I always love for the poet to see what resonates at the same time for people. I know we listen toward what we might begin. Yeah. Me some theorem, time works out, proving the proof of itself. Yeah, it is
that was
beautiful.
just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of lines like that too. Tamara just wrote wonderful reading, Jeff. And of course, the poem to Claudia Emerson, just
Beautiful.
gorgeous and stunning. Regina, you said wonderful reading, beautiful imagery and soul. Do you want to speak to that? Because I have a feeling you have some specific things you mean by that.
I will, and I apologize. I have my camera on because I'm just sitting here trying to fight off this sinus headache. The weather is interesting, but
I'm sorry.
I totally enjoyed this. And one thing that struck me when you started the poem in which you were talking about language and how you were a product of your language, almost like language was in your lineage. And so I don't know, all throughout your whole reading, just the spiritual kind of connection that I felt, and maybe I honed in on that because that is very much a part of what inspires me to write. Like, you know, this finding of God and everything, and that's just what I felt. I'm babbling and I sound crazy, but it was just.
You know, as you're talking, it reminds me of in my first book. This is like a lot of years ago, 17 years ago, but of course the poem's much older than that. But there's a poem I wrote. I know there's a line that says all form, which is strange because I do all this stuff with form throughout which I didn't know I would be doing eventually, but all form is a conversation with the fact or lack of God, something like that. I can't remember exactly the wording. But, you know, of course, in the beginning was the word, and this whole idea of being worded, that we might still be worded into existence. In fact, my fourth book, the epigraph, is just something from Wittgenstein. To imagine a language means to imagine a form of life. And so I'm always kind of thinking about the ways in which the language we surround ourselves with actually shapes our reality and forms us.
Yes.
And so whether that's, well, for me, a lot of times it's, you know, it's an REM song or a U2 song or Patty Griffin or something, but it's just language that I repeat. And sometimes I'll do little snippets and play it over and over and over all day long. Justified till we die, you and I will magnify the magnificent. That's from a U2 song.
Right.
But
But you know,
there are days that may be the only thing I hear all day long.
right, right. I think maybe when I'm referencing soul as well, when you were talking about your ancestors, I think this was maybe in some conversation between some of the poems. So I'll kind of run together. But that it's just a feeling that I had, and this concept of language, and maybe because I just wrote a poem on language and lineage, and so when you started to talk about that, I connected with that, and I just felt that in my soul, I guess. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
Thank you, Regina, for bringing up the issue, and it kind of reminds me of what Judy just wrote in there, that you do have an elegiac heart, and that was something I felt as he was reading. I thought that was very, 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 very true, and I kind of think that that's essentially what Regina is saying.
Yeah.
You're getting a lot of thanks in the chat section, which I'll send to you, Jeff. John wrote, "Thanks for a great, meaningful reading. Great reading, Jeff. Meaningful, memorable, and as always, remarkable. Good luck with Watermark." So you had not just one, but two books that came out during the pandemic, and I'm glad you read from the one from last year.
Yeah, that's a small chapbook that Seven Kitchens Press did, and I think I've got another book coming out later this year. But having written, I've written a poem every day for most of the last 20 years. Unless the book if this book comes out later in the year, it'll be the first thing that I have from the last 12 years. Watermark brings me up to about 2008 or 9. Almost nothing I've written, and I've written 2,500 poems in the last decade or more. Nothing I've written in the last decade has appeared in a book.
Oh.
So it's taken me a while to catch up.
I was going to say, at this rate, you have the next 5 years planned of 2 books a year.
That might get us close to get. Nobody wants that.
Good heavens! Well, I look forward to it, and I hope you'll come back with the next book.
Sure.
That would be fabulous. Does anybody have any specific questions for Jeff about process or about his writing, or you just want praise?
Yeah, I just
Jump on in. That's the way to do it.
have a question.
Yeah, Judy.
Yeah, I was interested in your comment about math, and I wanted you to spend a little more time on that, because I was really struck. Well, I've tried to put it in the chat, but that now I'm unable to quote it. I have to look at the chat to find it, but I can't. The theorem.
Yeah,
that
theorem.
was such an incredible line, but it seems to me a kind of gesture you make fairly frequently in your poems, if that makes any sense to you. We don't stop. We go to the X that's above the Y, and then the XY. It's one thing on top of another on top of another, which brings me to a new and interesting place. But it seems to speak to whatever it is that's behind everything we do or think. So I just wondered about the math part, if that's related, if it's related.
Yeah, that's interesting. Math and science were actually my best subjects, and I think for much of my childhood, I assumed I was going to be an engineer until about the 10th grade, when I decided I was kind of bored with math, because you could actually get the answer. And so much of life is kind of, what was it Huck Finn says? I don't put no stock in numbers, something like that. But yeah, I actually just did a workshop not a week ago about 14 conceptual strategies for shaping or generating poems.
Wow.
And I even talked a little bit about the math of that. That's, I've got these 14. There are a whole lot more, but then once you start combining them, multiplying this times that, all of a sudden it starts exponentially becoming all these greater possibilities for what poems could be or look like even. And I think for myself, I don't always write in form. I have a book of sonnets. Well, that's a form. This form that I created for this book. Some of my other books have shapes or poem shapes that that I kind of created, nonce forms, I guess.
Nonce forms, yeah.
And but it becomes a way to fill in a container to take, okay, everything from my life, even the taking up the cause of affection. It's 5 stanzas, but every stanza is 3 lines.
Mm.
So every stanza is like a kind of thing unto itself, and then the next thing, but hopefully they accrue, or they're in conversation with each other, or they're added to each other, or maybe something becomes a multiplier of the other, or
Wow.
this becomes interesting to consider. But I haven't really thought too much about how math has affected my writing, but I think it has.
Oh yeah, that's what I was thinking of. There's almost, I don't know how to explain it, but like a sense of a spatial awareness of the words in relationship to each other when you read.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think that there somewhere I even say something like, I want every word to be aware of every other word.
That's what
And I want every word to be both vehicle and tenor, so that they're all just like swirling, and we look through this one, but we understand every other. It touches every other word. Well, don't you mean like, no, I mean every other word,
Wow.
mine and every other word that has ever existed. I want this one word to find its way and help me to understand the complexity of every other word, which is impossible.
Yeah. So does that mean when you're writing, let's say you take, the Emily Dickinson lines as you did in that one line in that one poem, are you letting or even consciously inviting your internalized Emily Dickinson to come out a little bit in that poem? And is that part of the connection with every other word that ever existed?
Yeah. I think that's going to be part of the difficulty of this book, is like, okay, well, are the poems, is Hardin's poem an engagement with Yeats? Is it an engagement with, or is it speaking back to, or to what degree? How much does it lean toward Dickinson? How much does it lean toward Whitman in this poem, or Gerard Manley Hopkins? I don't think I let too much of that. I didn't want to just take up an engagement like head on, I think. But I wanted it to be like just again, this whispered prayer. And that maybe I'm meditating to some degree on, one of the poems uses faith as a fine invention, kind of well-known Dickinson line. And I think that poem is a kind of engagement with trying to figure out exactly like what is faith? I mean, it's this thing I've spent my whole life having faith. I mean, I have faith in faith, and I believe in belief, but at the same time, it's kind of the rational mind, the mathematical mind can't figure out exactly what this is. So maybe that's a poem that really directly, like, kind of leans into what the author is writing about. Of course, as I said, so many of these poems were written 15 years ago. So I'm not exactly in the same space as I was when I was writing the poems.
That's an interesting thought too, about that time, 15 years ago, the person that wrote the poems and now the person who reads them. I like that.
Yeah.
Has that been interesting to come and see them or like read them?
Oh, yes. Yeah. In fact, the very last poem in the book is the one that uses the longest, Acts 17:28, for in him we live and move and have our being. And just this past year, the man that I feature in the poem, a kind of very well-known local man around town, homeless. But anyway, he died this past year. And so he's at the very end of, he's in my poem. He's in this poem that I wrote so many years ago, but now he's not here. And when I read the poem not too long ago at a reading, and I don't know, the power of the poem and the absence of him, just, a man that you'd be going down a hillside, going to Walmart or to the mall or whatever, and he'd be on the side with a shopping cart and he would wave at people, and people knew him. And and I would wave at him, and just this kind of eye contact that he would make with you, just beautiful, just a beautiful presence in the world. And now he's not here, but that particular poem closes my book, and I'm really glad that it does now. I'm really glad that I was able to get a kind of a local. Everybody knew him. So
I love that that's the last poem in your book, and
Yeah.
that reading it now has a very different feel to it.
Yeah, it
The
does.
loss, the absence, that's big.
Mm.
Did I miss any questions in the chat section? Because I have been trying to be mindful of that, but if I missed a question, feel free just to jump in. And if not, we'll take a moment to thank Jeff for reading, and we will head towards open mic. So do we have any last questions or thoughts or insights?
My name's Mike. And so when you were saying that these poems that you're publishing, you're not the same person you were when you wrote them. Have you ever thought of doing a kind of dialogue? You take a poem from that time and you write a poem in response to the person you are now to the person you were then, and almost like a companion piece.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I have thought of something like that. There's a poem in my first book called Sequel to Whitman's I Saw in Louisiana a Live Oak Growing. So I wrote a whole series of sequel poems to other people's poems. Right? Totally preposterous. But I did. And I liked the poem. I liked it enough to actually publish it and get it in a book. But a lot of the other poems I wrote, didn't really rise to that level. But I have had the kind of thought of doing like sequels to my own poems. And it's funny you mentioned that, because you're kind of speaking back to a previous way of thinking. And of course, we all change over time, and that makes sense. And of course, when you read a poem that you wrote 20 years ago or 25 years ago, there's that kind of desire perhaps to like, okay, if I could have a redo, maybe I could write this poem better now. And of course, that's a delusion. you probably couldn't, or I couldn't. I might as well just go on and write the next one. So.
Oh, I love that though, and I also like your engagement with form and how again it's that spatial awareness, that building of a poem that I love hearing your process about. That was fascinating. It really, and also the stitching. Your wife would be very happy with that term. The seamstress would be smiling. All right, guys. Well, I didn't take notes on who wanted to read for open mic. I seem to be slack today and very relaxed. So how we can do it is, first off, I'd like to take a moment to really honor Jeff for reading for us and just fabulous discussion. Thank you so much. I like that we can raise the hands. Thank you, Regina. I always forget that I have a little hand that I can raise.
Where did that go?
If anybody, okay, Chris, that you knew exactly where I was going. Thank you, Christy. Jump on in, girl.
Okay, so I had planned on reading something different tonight, but when I heard the line, the nouns and verbs I live with, I changed my poem idea. So I'm going to go with this one, and it's called Coming to Terms with Mothering as a Verb, Letting Go of the Noun I Wanted to Be, Rocking My Nephew for the First Time. Each newborn breath swallows moonlight, closed eyelids flutter, lashes lick towards fall raindrops. A tiny tongue's thirst quench flick sounds as day breaks. His refreshed spirit awakens my soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Lovely. I'm
Thank
glad
you.
that hit one of his phrases inspired you to read that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we unmute the mic and have him read? Think about it. And Judy, can you read from your new book?
I felt like reading when I listened to Jeff. I
He
felt
inspired
like going
you.
back to
Good.
my second book of poetry, which was published and then republished in 2012, but it was originally published in 2008, if I remember correctly. So I kind of like to do that if I could. It's
Please,
just a matter
please.
of finding something that feels connected in some way that's purely intuitive. So this is called The Withering of Their State, and it has an epigraph from Acts, and all that believed were together and had all things common. In the end, they lose all their chains and ghost and swirl by each other in the closed bubble of the reminiscence wing like flakes of snow in an upended souvenir globe. In the end, they wander in the deserts of each other's synonymous small rooms, their possessions winnowed like so much chaff in a chill breeze, sold by beleaguered daughters, parted to goodwill, the leaving squeezed in with the new twin bed, one table, one uneasy chair, the old TV they have forgotten how to turn on. And in the end, no one among them lacks. For if one sits shivering on the toilet where the attendant has deposited him, dreaming and losing a dream of dry warmth like a distant bell, the groaning wardrobe of his roommate may yet open unto him. And in the end, the scales fall from their eyes, and they fall asleep in each other's chairs, and thine is mine, and now is then, and mildly, with the most gracious of ohs, they allow themselves to be removed, guided away by their pliant elbows, by those who still live in the bordered world. My dad had something, dementia, Alzheimer's, you can't really tell. And this was many years ago, but lived in one of these facilities close by, fortunately. So that came out of that experience.
Gorgeous, just beautiful. Swept away. Jeff, you look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, and I was just thinking those last words, bordered world. So yeah, I love to, we all probably do this, but look at the endings of poems. They're just so mysterious sometimes. Like, how did the poet get there? And why those words? And those are the perfect words, but now I want to know why. I want to go back through the poem. So little moments like that, I just love that. It's fantastic conclusion to that poem.
Yeah, gorgeous. And I love too that both people have read in response to your work, Jeff. I don't think that we've had that specifically, so that's of interest to me.
It's hard not to respond to the mood and the largely almost subliminal feelings that a particular poet with a very definite approach and style, I think that's the great joy of poetry. I'm always affected by everything I've just heard, in ways that can sometimes lead to new poems and sometimes get lost, but
I think that's very,
yeah,
but I think that's the beautiful thing, Judy. And it actually reminds me of the discussion we were having before we really got started. And Jeff was saying, while other people are watching, I forget what you said. Maybe it was, what did you say?
Criminal Minds.
There we go, Criminal Minds. He's YouTubing or looking up poets and listening to poets. And I was thinking about one of the things that I've loved about doing our Thursdays is seeing up on YouTube that the videos are being viewed dozens of times, sometimes hundreds of times. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing.
great. Yeah.
Yes. So while, I definitely have felt the challenges, I love Zoom for the fact that we are with each other and getting to hear poets that I otherwise wouldn't have had an opportunity to sit in a room with, and to celebrate community, which that was one thing that I thought you did perfectly, Jeff, by starting with someone else's book. I mean, it's hard enough to sell a book of poetry in the best of times. And I think it's wonderful that we get to support each other this way. It's that community. And I admire, the people that build that.
Well,
that
Malika, you foster it. So thanks to you
Oh, thanks.
as well.
Yeah.
As
Well, y'all have been my highlight of the week, always. And I feel very fortunate to, have been able to do this. Celestine, did you want to read? Oh, I couldn't tell if that was a hand up or a clap. Let me know,
That
honey.
was a clap. That was a clap for you building community.
My friend. Do you
One
have,
day soon I'll read.
okay. We'll come back to you and you'll read. That sounds good. Would anybody else to read a poem or just have a comment or just tell us how your day went? Okay. Well, that is good. My sense is then maybe we've ended on a high note. I like the responses. And Celestine, if you do want to read, let me know. We'll be right here.
Oh no, I don't want to read. I saw
Um,
at one of your openings in the future. But I just want to say when you
Okay,
talked about
I
William
gotcha.
Stafford, that really perked my ears up because that's one of my favorite poets. He's really reading one of his poems, even though I've always read poetry, but after reading one of his poems, I decided really I wanted to be a poet because he just speaks so clearly. He speaks so clearly about complex things. It just rings in my heart what he said, how he says and does what he does. So thank you for sharing that.
Good. Yeah, I love
That's
Stafford.
awesome.
There's a poem I looked at today. At the very ending of it, he says something like, "And holy days inside the calendar wake up and chime." That's the ending of the poem called "How You Know," and it's in the book, Even in Quiet Places. So
That just made me also think, Celestine, in mapping out your lineage for writers, what is your watermark? What are the other things that have created us as a writer, which is essentially, Jeff's book.
Absolutely.
Well, thank y'all so very much for joining us in celebrating Jeff Hardin's newest book, Watermark. It was fabulous to be together.
Thank you, Malika.
guys.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye-bye.
Well, bye. Good night.